Greetings, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to episode 26 of the Nurse Trauma Healing Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Lorre Laws, and I am a nurse scientist, author, and trauma burnout expert. And today we will be discussing some startling survey results where nurse workplace violent conditions, burnout, and trauma are concerned. So recently, I had the very good fortune to have my research featured by the National League of Nurses. After self-funding 5 years of research across 4 disciplines, I presented a snapshot of that work in my presentation titled, "What if it's not burnout? Trauma-informed resilient strategies for nurses." Now, for those of you who have never submitted a proposal to speak at a national conference, let me tell you, that is quite a process. Every conference has their own system, their own portal, their own requirements, which means you have to register and enroll and go through all the authentication processes. And then you submit the particulars, like the title, the learning objectives, and also you have to submit a very rigorously developed outline and make explicit all the teaching methods and resources that you will use. And the list goes on from there. So it is and rightfully so, it's a pretty rigorous vetting to ensure that the highest level of evidence is brought and the highest quality of presentations are brought to the nurses. And so once you submit the proposal, which takes several hours, then it's like this hurry up and wait game, which takes several months. All submissions are blind peer reviewed and most proposals are rejected. Only the best, most relevant presentations are selected. And I was just so fortunate to be among those who were selected, not only this year, but in the preceding year. So letters of acceptance are then sent out several months before the event. And then there's a whole nother layer of planning that happens, the usual travel logistics, along with preparing the presentation itself. And when it comes to preparing presentations, well, I just don't hold back. I've been a university educator for well over a decade, and I have learned that death by PowerPoint is not the presentation style that I am striving for. So the last thing I ever want to do for my students or my colleagues who are attending a high-level national conference is to bore them with a sea of banal PowerPoint slides that result in an hour of mind-numbing bullet points. So I got creative and learned how to use a whole bunch of new technologies and really with the objective to this conference to have nurses feel something, to really connect their experience to their healer's heart, to what is happening in our profession, which is a lot of nurse-specific trauma exposure, violence, bullying, gaslighting, unsafe and downright dangerous staffing ratios, lack of resources, and the list goes on. So during the 50-minute presentation, where I had over 200 nurses in attendance, there was such a sense of connection. Oh, I got goosebumps as I even speak about this. Connection, camaraderie, and community. It was beautiful. Those in attendance laughed, they cried, they had rounds of spontaneous applause, and they shared their experiences. We gathered to have some real talk about the gaslighting that is happening today and the very outdated burnout narrative and definitions, which are not trauma-informed. So when we are looking at our profession and interprofessional teams that are in healthcare systems worldwide, what you can really come to realize when you take a look in the evidence base, as I have done, is that it's not just occupational stress that is not being effectively managed. What's really happening is that the stress, this so-called stress, well, when you start to examine that, it's really trauma exposure, much of which is avoidable and secondary to system and organizational inadequacies. So for those of you who are just joining, and I'll drop the image in the show notes, each of us have a myriad of individual trauma exposures that we have endured in our lifetime, which are in varying degrees of healedness. Whatever was not healed at the time of the incident is stored in the body. And then we have nurse-specific traumas, two categories of which we have been trained to manage: vicarious or secondary trauma and trauma from disasters. We do get some training regarding those types of trauma exposures. We don't have a lot of support, but we get some training, right? But then there's the avoidable. And the avoidable nurse-specific traumatization is really what's driving nurses from the profession. And it includes like how we are transmitting nurse ancestral generational trauma. It's called historical trauma, from one generation to the next. You know, that whole nurses eating their young thing, right? That's historical trauma being transmitted, often below the level of our awareness. And then there's workplace violence, which I have covered and will continue to cover ad nauseum. And that includes not only the physical and verbal threats and assaults that we get from those in our care, but also, uh, you know, colleague to colleague lateral violence, bullying, hazing, gaslighting, incivilities of all sorts. And then there's system-induced trauma. And that's really where the system is the problem. So a great example of this, the system is inflicting further trauma. A great example of this is that when a person, such as myself, who has been physically assaulted, takes it to the supervisor, runs it up the chain of command according to policy, the first question that is asked is, what could you have done differently? All right, I've already been traumatized. I am in here with bruises and wounded skin. And you're asking me what I could have done? And so that is, perceived by the nervous system as yet just another layer of trauma. And then there's the insufficient resource trauma, which we're very familiar with, the often dangerous staffing ratios, and also lack of resources or limited resources. And then there's the second victim traumas, which are secondary. This would be like your adverse events, your missed near misses, and your sentinel events. For which a lot of nurses embody a lot of guilt and shame, despite the fact that the vast majority of root causes are system errors, system inadequacies, having nothing to do with the nurse. And so we have this really high level of trauma exposure, some of which is inherent to our profession and most of which is avoidable. So after I explained all of this, and the body language was very affirming, like the nurses were in attendance were really getting it, and they were feeling it, and they were connecting it to their lived experiences. And then I brought forth the very outdated definition of burnout, the one that the World Health Organization uses. And I'm quoting that burnout is a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. Is it just me, or are we detecting a blame the victim narrative here? It's not just stress, it is inordinate amounts of trauma exposures. I mean, yes, of course, we all as nurses have chronic workplace stress. We know that that comes with the gig, right? It is the substantial trauma exposure that is secondary to the broken healthcare system and organizational shortcomings, the dangerous staffing ratio, the lack of resources, and the often physically violent families or patients, the bullying, the gaslighting, the hazing, and all of the workplace incivilities. These are all forms of avoidable nurse-specific traumatization. And then we get to that avoidable system-induced trauma, like I just talked about. It's like, what could you have been done differently as somebody came up and assaulted you from behind, right? So it's like, are you for real, World Health Organization? Does this sound to you World Health Organization that this is just workplace stress that's not being effectively managed? I mean, are you kidding me? It is trauma exposure that often results in nurse-specific traumatization, which cannot be wholly prevented, addressed, or healed by traditional self-care approaches. So in the show notes, I'm going to drop a screenshot of how the World Health Organization is defining burnout as an occupational phenomenon. As though I, you, or anyone on the planet has two nervous systems, one that we have outside of work and one that we have inside of work. It's not how basic physiology works. It's befuddling to me that we are still defining burnout as it was described and introduced in 1970. Over 50 years later, we still have an outdated, a very woefully outdated definition and approach to burnout, which is in the vast majority of cases, nurse-specific traumatization. So let's unpack this WHO definition a bit further. And let's add a trauma-informed perspective to each of the dimensions of burnout that WHO classifies. Okay, so WHO says that the first dimension of burnout is that it is classified by energy depletion or exhaustion. Now let's expand that to make a trauma-informed burnout dimension number one. How about it is the physical, verbal, cognitive, emotional, relational, or existential prolonged stress and trauma exposures that, when left unsupported and unhealed, lead to mitochondrial rigidity and dysfunction, whereby the mitochondria are unable to produce enough energy to sustain the person working in these conditions, thereby resulting in energy depletion and exhaustion. Let's call it what it is. You see, nurse-specific traumatization, it's an energy problem, right down to the level of the mitochondria. So let's look at the WHO's burnout definition dimension number two, which reads, it is increased mental distance from one's jobs, feelings of negativism, cynicism related to the job. All right, so now let's reframe that. Let's update 50 years of outdated science and make it trauma-informed. That would read something like this. Prolonged stress and trauma exposures are detected by the midbrain's threat detector, which signals to the autonomic nervous system to activate the fight, flight, fawn, or freeze responses that result in rightfully distancing oneself from one's job, negative worldviews, absenteeism, presenteeism, and a host of other behavioral adaptations designed to keep a person safe when in unsafe conditions. That speaks to today's nursing practice contexts. And not just nursing, all health professionals, and not just in the United States, worldwide. All right, so let's take a look at the third burnout dimension. And this is, according to WHO, reduced professional efficacy. Sometimes I just don't have words, right? Now let's make this trauma-informed and update it with the current state of the science. Professional efficacy is optimized when individuals are safe, regulated in their nervous system, and thriving in their window of tolerance and ventral vagal tone. Employers who do not provide safe, sufficiently staffed and resourced units that are free from workplace violence, including verbal, gaslighting, extortion, bullying, and other incivilities, promote reduced professional efficacy, burnout, and occupational-related traumatization. So let us place accountability where it belongs, which are in our systems, in the organizations in which we work. And it is not a shortcoming of any healthcare professional or nurse, given today's substantial trauma exposure in the workplace. So, we have non-trauma informed burnout definitions. And what does that mean? It means that, well, then we also don't get insurance coverage for treatment. It's a double whammy. So to add insult to whose gaslighting burnout definitions, which are reduced to an occupational phenomenon and not a medical condition in the International Classification of Diseases, ICD-11. And I quote, burnout refers specifically to phenomena in the occupational context and should not be applied to describe experiences in other areas of life. So are you saying that people have one body, one set of anatomy, one set of physiology at work, and that they leave all of that at work, they put that in their locker and they close it at the end of the day, and then they put on a brand new body and brand new anatomy and physiology and nervous system and vagus nerve and take that one home? Is that what you're saying? How convenient. How utterly convenient and utterly reductionistic. So let me get this straight. Who blamed the victim for the system and organizational shortcomings that resulted in prolonged stress and often avoidable trauma exposures? And then who infers that nurses and other professionals are not whole persons who are inseparable from their systems and the contexts in which they live and work? I mean, we are whole people. We don't have a work self and a non-work self. There's not occupational phenomenon and then home life phenomenon, and they are on two different buckets, and never will the two commingle. I mean, this is outdated, like 100-year-old paradigms on which these definitions, many are built. All right. And so who is essentially inferring that we each have an off switch that we can apply to stress and traumatization and their responses, depending on if we're at work or in another context? We just have like different on and off switches. I mean, I've never seen them, but it's inferred here that our bodies are actually like mechanistic. They're machines that can discern between an occupational context and other areas of life in the physiological responses to stress and traumatization, most of which are occurring below the level of conscious anyway. And then, as if that's not enough, then it excluded burnout from the ICD-11. So even if a person seeks medical attention, if they are brave enough to risk being stigmatized by their employer and colleagues, and they're brave enough and have enough courage to actually seek medical attention from the devastating and often debilitating symptoms that emerge in the wake of nurse-specific traumatization, that is not just burnout. It's not just an occupational phenomenon that you're not managing correctly. And now you're going to deny us insurance coverage to seek treatment and support. Like, it's just like gaslighting on top of gaslighting on top of gaslighting meets blame the victim. When I started examining all of this, I was aghast, and you can tell I'm a little bit lit up right now because it is unconscionable. It really is. That that this is the context, and these are the policies guiding how we work and practice. So let's review, for the purposes of the World Health Organization and other leaders out there, that despite being an occupational high risk profession, nurses, 86 of whom report having little to no resources in helping them manage the trauma exposures and the healing that they need to accomplish. A whopping almost 25% of nurses meet the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. And then there's 91% of nurses who report one or more PTSD symptom. And then we're being gaslighted by the outdated position statements and burnout narratives that inform policies like WHO's and excludes this from the ICD-11. It is way past time to update the burnout is an occupational phenomenon and you're not managing it effectively narrative. And let's call it what it is. In our profession, nurses, it's nurse-specific traumatization. And that requires an entirely different approach to prevent, address, and heal. And well, that's why I'm here. I am here to shine a massive spotlight on what the science is really saying and how nurses can embrace pathways to healing and insulate themselves from the impact of the broken healthcare system. So, in closing, if you or someone you know has been affected by nurse-specific traumatization, please seek support immediately. It's not just burnout. In the vast majority of cases, and I and my team are standing by to help you however possible. Please consider taking a 5-question nurse trauma assessment, and I'll drop that link in the show notes. And you're always welcome to schedule a personal call with me, and I will help you navigate this and explore the best healing options for you and what you're experiencing in your life. So until next time, we'll drop those links in the chat too. Sorry, in the show notes. Until next time, thank you. Thank you so much for all that you are and all that you do. I see you. I feel you. I hear you. And I am here for you. From my healer's heart to yours. Namaste.